I want to turn our attention to what's happening outside of Israel. In a rare impromptu Friday night speech, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak warned against a growing threat to democracy after far-left and accused anti-Semite George Galloway was elected to Parliament. Now, Sunak says the weekly UK protests against Israel's war on Hamas have descended into chaos and planned acts of violence, something he wants the police to crack down on.
In recent weeks and months, we have seen a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality. What started as protests on our street has descended into intimidation, threats, and planned acts of violence. Jewish children fearful to wear their school uniform lest it reveal their identity. And it is beyond alarming that last night, the Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October the 7th, who glorifies Hezbollah and is endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the BNP. We are a country where we love our neighbours and we are building Britain together. But I fear that our great achievement in building the world's most successful multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy is being deliberately undermined. There are forces here at home trying to tear us apart. Since October the 7th, there have been those trying to take advantage of the very human angst that we all feel about the terrible suffering that war brings to the innocent, to women and children, to advance a divisive, hateful ideological agenda. On too many occasions recently, our streets have been hijacked by small groups who are hostile to our values and have no respect for our democratic traditions.
I'm joined from London now by I24 News UK correspondent Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, thank you for being with us as always. When we hear about Rishi Sunak, he talks about this threat. I'm curious, what is the real threat Sunak is talking about? Is it being blown out of proportion at all?
Depends really who you ask whether or not you think this threat's being blown out of proportion. Rishi Sunak could be, on the one hand, making what is effectively a political speech on the doorstep of Downing Street because he's gradually losing grip of his own party with divisions within the Conservative Party, and also, it appears, of the country, with him fully expected to lose an upcoming general election due some point in the coming months. On the other hand, we could take him at face value and assume that what he's doing here is making an important and much needed intervention, as some people see it, as tension is rising on the streets, outside the homes of MPs, outside Parliament itself, while it debated that important but non-binding resolution about whether there should be a ceasefire in the war in Gaza. However, you look at this, Rishi Sunak was very forceful in his words. He said that there should be no room for extremism, for violence, for undermining of democratic values and processes, or for anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim sentiment and action within the UK. And there's another area where people have focused on what he said. While it was powerful, while it was much needed as far as many in the Jewish community are concerned, he did talk a fair bit about anti-Muslim sentiment, many people asking why that is being prioritized as much as anti-Jewish sentiment, which seems to be a more pressing problem for some at the moment. Of course, on the other side, there are those saying that there's anti-Muslim sentiment within his own Conservative Party, and he focused on the far right. Again, something that some say is nowhere near as big a problem as far left and Islamist anti-Semitism and undermining of democracy that's going on the streets. So he's really entering into a minefield here with this speech, but perhaps that's his intention, to show some sort of strong leadership and try to resolve the issue, both for the betterment of the country and for his party and the government.
When you talk about resolving the issue, what about the significance of this speech at all? It's a late night speech on a Friday night right outside his doorstep. So it certainly indicates that Sunak wanted to address this right away as quickly as possible.
Downing Street speeches like this one aren't meant to be political. Indeed, he has the podium there of 10 Downing Street, not of the Conservative Party. And there was a political section in there. If you actually look at the gov.uk website where they put up the text of speeches, they've redacted a section there where he spoke specifically about George Galloway, the candidate who just won in the Rochdale by-election. Very controversial candidate. And what Rishi Sunak said there was indeed political, so much so that they've removed it from the transcript on the official website. He said that a candidate was returned in that by-election who diminished what happened on the 7th of October in Israel, who supported Hezbollah, and who also was endorsed, he said, by Nick Griffin, who, for international viewers, is the former head of the British National Party, a racist party. So he was quite frank that part of the motivation for him giving this speech is not just the extremism that's been seen on the streets of London in those protests and other forms as well, but also the by-election result which saw George Galloway returning to the House of Commons. Galloway, of course, with fighting talk, saying that he had no respect for the Prime Minister and that the Prime Minister had very little mandate, whereas he had just been elected with quite a high majority in Rochdale. Again, none of that is necessarily incorrect. Galloway has been returned with a resounding majority in that by-election. There are many reasons for that, not least that the Labour Party in the end pulled out from supporting the candidate it had selected because of his anti-Semitism. You can see really where all the confusion arises and where all the concerns about extremism and anti-Semitism are coming from. But even in Rishi Sunak's speech, very few actual solutions, very little in terms of new policy. He did criticise the police, which has independence from the government, in quite a strong way, saying that he did support the police, but in effect he was calling on them to do more. For example, when From the River to the Sea was projected onto the parliamentary buildings, onto Big Ben, that famous London landmark, those images were beamed around the world, and that phrase is one that Sunak himself has spoken out against as being racist and anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, genocidal even. So he's asking the police perhaps to act more decisively when they're encountering things like that, saying that the government will back them, but it is up to the police whether they choose to do that.
Jonathan, you mentioned that Sunak didn't really throw out any real solutions. So at the end of the day, is this all just election campaigning? The UK is going to go to an election at any unspecified time before January. So is that what this boils down to?
It could be, and on the other hand, it could be a genuine, heartfelt, sincere intervention on the part of a Prime Minister who feels that the country is in crisis. I think it's up to individuals to decide which of those they think is the true meaning of the speech. Certainly, Rishi Sunak didn't need to make that speech. I'm not sure if it will win him any more votes, particularly. Many people, most people, assume that the next election is lost for the Conservative Party. However, he has suffered within his own party from being weak, effectively. His reputation for not being the most bold or impressive or charismatic of leaders. There are other characters within the Conservative Party who speak a stronger speech, they fight a stronger fight, at least verbally, and they've made more bold interactions and interventions in terms of policy ideas. Rishi Sunak is seen as a sort of safe pair of hands, almost a technocrat. Maybe now he's trying to show himself also as a strong ideologue who stands up for democratic, pluralistic values within the UK. If that's the case, we'll have to wait and see if it has that positive effect for him. Either way, there are many in the Jewish community and beyond who are grateful for this intervention, and they think that it shows a seriousness to deal with the problem, even if it doesn't necessarily announce any policy changes or enough action to actually help resolve the problem. It certainly brings to the foreground the problem itself and says out loud something that many people are feeling inside their homes and maybe are a bit afraid to say too widely.
Certainly, and certainly something to look at going forward with the election. Jonathan Sajadoti, thank you so much for that update.